These films were taken between 1940 and 1943 at Fort Stevens, Oregon, and Fort Canby, Washington, with the permission of the commander then, as a training film sequence for the troops. He required me to put some of them in a restricted category, which was the security classification at that time. This is the sun coming up from the east over Fort Stevens, headquarters battery of the 18th buildings. These pictures are taken from the water tower at the south of the post, located on the hill there, looking toward the river. You can see the post headquarters in the center, the commanding officer's quarters directly below us, and the river in the background. Quartermaster buildings just going out of view on the right. The line of officers' quarters on the left coming into view behind the post headquarters in the center of the parade ground. This at Thanksgiving Day 1941 is the 249th Band marching onto the football field where there was a football game between the 18th Regiment and the 249th Oregon National Guard Regiment, which had been called to active duty in September 1940. This is a composite platoon of the 249th marching onto the field, and they will be doing a silent manual drill for the halftime of the football game. You'll notice that they had the old style helmets, which all of the troops at Fort Stevens and Fort Canby of the harbor defenses had to use until about the summer of 1942. The 249th was called into federal duty in September 1940 at Camp Clatsop, and then about 6 months later moved to a new cantonment area built at Fort Stevens. We'll see pictures of that shortly. These are the brick quarters, which were bachelor officers' quarters. This is Lieutenant Tom Davis, the adjutant of the 18th Coast Artillery. These officers, after a parade, are Colonel Roundtree, the commander of the 18th, and his staff. John Charters, Major Gregory, Ken Pell, Ralph Brink, at Fort Stevens. This is in September 1941, when Colonel Kelly B. Lemon took command of the harbor defenses and had a parade on the cantonment parade ground of all of the units at Fort Stevens. Colonel Lemon going out to review the troops, and Colonel Roundtree, CO of the 18th Regiment, and his staff accompanying him. This parade ground was created on a marshy area with wood chips from the various sawmills around that area. Colonel Lemon reviewing the troops at this parade. Colonel Roundtree, the commander of troops, and his staff. Lieutenant Davis on the left, and Lieutenant Heath on the right. These are troops of the harbor defenses marching in review for Colonel Lemon. massed flags of the two regiments. Colonel Lemon reviewing the troops. This is a quartermaster unit going past in review. You can see the cantonment type barracks in the background to which the 249th moved about December 1940. This is Colonel Lemon meeting all of the officers of both the 249th and the 18th. Colonel Roundtree in the background introducing the various officers. The officer in the short coat was the commander of the mine planter that had come up from San Francisco for some practice mine planting. We'll see more of the planter in a later sequence. Major Rogers of the quartermaster. This is a parade on Armistice Day 1941 in Seaside, where troops of the 18th, here's Colonel Roundtree in the center, Lieutenant Charters on the right, Lieutenant Heath on the left. These 18th Coast Artillery troops came down to participate in the Armistice Day parade in Seaside in November 1941. This is a guard mount at Fort Stevens, where the officer of the day is checking the guard personnel before they go on duty. You can see the Fort Stevens sign on the back, in the back here, on the quartermaster warehouse, which of course was painted over on December 8th, the day after the war started. This is the post headquarters building with the guard, after having been inspected, ready to march off to their posts. You can see the hospital building up on the hill at the far left in this picture. And again, the cantonment type barracks that were built for the 18th in this particular case, because it was on the main part of Fort Stevens. This is a fishing boat that came in over the waves during a storm at about the same location as the Peter Ardale. The pilot was taken off thinking the boat was going to capsize, but it came in over the waves with the coffee pot still on the stove, so it had a pretty easy ride. These are troops of the harbor defenses looking over the boat, which later was taken off out over the waves. Here Major Houston is taking down the flag, which you note was put upside down as a signal of distress. This is a ship which ran aground about the same position as the Peter Ardale on December 8th or 9th, 1941, had been en route to Hawaii, tried to get back into the river mouth, but the Cape Disappointment light had been turned off, and they couldn't find the entrance to the harbor, so they ran aground. On the beach, you can see the Christmas trees and turkeys that they had been taking to Hawaii, which are all covered with the fuel oil. This was in early December 1941. About a year later, this was all that was left of the ship. The Japanese submarine which fired at Battery Russell in June of 1942 did not hit Battery Russell, and so they erected this sign, 9 shots fired, 9 shots missed, to hell with you, Hirohito. This was in June 1942. These are pictures of the shell fragments which are gathered up on the beach. Quite a number of craters, all of which were short of Battery Russell, in the sand on the beach. There was quite a crew that went out to pick up all the shell fragments pieced together and sent back with a long report to the Chief of Ordnance. This is a picture. Lieutenant Colonel Motz, the ordnance officer, is holding a piece of the shell, which you can see was a very poor steel, poor fragmentation. It should have broken up into many, many little pieces. This is a reconstruction of the shell, which we determined to be a 5-inch shell from the deck of the submarine. The regimental supply office for the 18th was just back of the line of officers' quarters, and from this place regimental equipment was distributed, and also this was the ration distribution point for the regiment. Some rations were received in kind through quartermaster channels, others were purchased with funds. Captain Charters on the left, the regimental supply officer, and his crew with Master Sergeant Labacetta, the very short man, in the center of the film now. This was the crew that received the rations, broke it down into the portions for the various batteries, and then distributed it to the batteries of the 18th at Fort Stevens. This is then Captain Charters with the first Jeep that we received in fall of 1941. You can see the buildings are not yet painted. The OD that we painted immediately when the war started in December. This is Lieutenant Eichholz and the engineers' inspection car, which they turned over to the Searchlight Battery. His first sergeant on the right and the car operator on the left. This car was used to go out on the jetty to inspect the searchlights which we had installed there. You can see the waves even on a calm day, are pretty rough. It was quite a task to go out on the jetty to check the searchlights, because the waves, such as in this picture, would break over the railroad track. In one case, we had the little yellow car pushed off the track. Thank goodness it didn't go into the ocean, so we pulled it back and retrieved it. These are logs from a lumber raft that broke up, which when they were tossed up on the jetty were pretty harmful. This is the type of rock that was used to initially make the jetty and later to rehabilitate it. Huge, great big rocks which were put into place one by one with a crane. This is a destroyer going out of the mouth of the river, looking from the south toward the Washington side. The puff of white smoke is the whistle of the destroyer as it was signaling to the harbor entrance control post that it was departing. Again, these films were labeled restricted by the commanding officer's order because he was concerned about security at that time. This is the front crane of the distribution box boat in September 1941 at a practice mine planting. Here the crew is picking up the buoy, marking the position of the distribution box on the floor of the river, picks it up, puts it on the front end. This is Lieutenant Hendricks in charge of the distribution box operation. The mine planter had come up from San Francisco to assist us in a practice mine planting. This is a picture of the distribution box, and this is the planter that came up from San Francisco. Here we have a wartime mine, service mine, the cylindrical object and the concrete anchor right ahead of it. We'll see it drop in a minute as they trigger the davit. There it goes. The procedure was that the planter would come past the distribution box. Here it comes, 1,300 tons. We were all hoping the man knew how to drive it correctly. They would come past the distribution box, throw a line which pulled in a cable, was put in the distribution box, and then the planter went on out to its position, a predetermined position, to plant the mine. Then would get a new mine ready, come back past the distribution box, and repeat the procedure. Here comes the planter again with the new mine ready to go, passes the cable to the distribution box. on out to its predetermined position, drops the mine, and continues that for the whole group of mines, about 18 mines in a group. The planter was about 188 feet long and had 2 officers and a crew of about 50 men. Here comes the planter again, ready to plant the next mine. The cable from this mine would play off the fantail, the rear of the planter, at a predetermined length that had been cut, spliced, and ready to go. Here's the cable paying off the rear of the planter. This is a practice mine. You can see it's a great deal smaller, with a smaller charge of explosive in it, purely to determine if the plotting crew would be able to explode the mine at the correct time. This little round ball is the practice mine with the anchor just forward of it. Here the distribution box is being tied down, ready to be lowered onto the bottom of the river, which is the connection of all the cables from the mines to the box, and then one cable to the mine casemate, which was located at Fort Columbia on the Washington side. We always had one of these little 26-foot yawls following the mine planter as a safety measure to assure that if someone was pulled in by a cable, they would be able to pick them up. This is the target that was used, towed behind the mine yawl with a long line, so that the plotting crew could practice firing the mine at the correct moment when the ship would go over it. When these mines are exploded, they stun the fish in the river, and as we'll see in a minute, the little boats go out, pick them up, and bring them back, so that the mine battery always had fresh fish during the days of mine practice. We'll see in a minute a couple of mines going off, one on the left here of the target. This is a picture taken from the towing boat. There goes a small practice mine being exploded. On the right here in just a moment, there's another one. The target towboat going out. Here's one of the fish that had been stunned by the explosion of the mines in the river. This again is a small 26-foot mine yawl, we called them. This is the little train that usually is used to move the mines and the anchors out to the mine planter, but after the practice is over, takes all the people back. This is Lieutenant Hendricks, who after the war returned to Astoria, became the head of maintenance for the electric company, retired, and is now living in Astoria. When the war started, there was no mine planter at Fort Stevens, so they commandeered the smaller of Captain Elfing's 2 ferry boats, turned it into a mine planter, and this is the ferry as a mine planter after its conversion. It turned out to be better than the mine planter in that there was more deck space, and in spite of the fact that it was an ungainly looking thing, as this picture shows, it did a very good job of planting the wartime field in mid and late December of 1941. Here are the mines. This is Captain Bigland, the head of the mine battery of the 18th Coast Artillery, and Lieutenant Lauer, his executive officer. You can see the mines aligned along the deck of the ferry boat, which Captain Elfing had named the Tourist Number 2. Pretty cold out there on the river. Ship going down in the background. Here's the distribution box boat going out to its assigned position to pick up the DB and sit there while the planter makes figure of eights around the DB box. This is the type of clothing that the men used, waterproof and protect them from the weather. Here they're getting a mine ready to hang over the side and trip at the right time. The ferry boat mine planter moved a great deal slower than the regular mine planter did, and so it took quite a bit longer to plant the wartime minefield, but the job was completed. Distribution box boat on the right, and the ferry getting ready to go past it. Toss a line and then the cable and go on out to the predetermined position for planting that particular mine. Here the crew on the DB boat is ready to pick up the cable, take it up to the forward end of the DB boat, put it in the box, and then the planter would continue on out to plant the mine at the predetermined position. This is the cable paying out from the fantail of the mine planter from the DB boat, where they put one end of it, to the place where the mine will be positioned. They hold on to it to stretch it so that the predetermined length will be sufficient to get the mine to the planting position. You remember I mentioned that we had the small mine yawl following in case one of these men caught their foot in the cable and was pulled overboard. Getting another mine ready to plant. Here it goes. That's a picture of it going down. The distribution box boat on its way back after the mine planting. Here again, they're pulling in the cable, connected to the forward end of the DB box boat, and then the planter would go on out, put the mine down at the correct position. Again, the cable paying out from the fantail of the planter. This cable was about 1 inch in diameter. Here goes another mine. There's the mine yawl, the safety vessel that was always following the planter. Pretty rough work for these men on the small boat. Here the mine yawl is being used to transfer people and equipment between the distribution box boat and the planter. You can see the wind is coming from the right, blowing the flags of the DB boat. Some equipment coming aboard the planter. This is a picture of the DB boat taken through the window of the restroom on the planter. Shipping went on in the river during this planting. This is a picture of Mount Helen looking straight up the river east before it blew its top. This is the distribution box boat in dry dock, about 65 foot, a crew of 6 men. These Seacoast artillery firings taken in '42 were with the permission of the commanding officer to be used as training films, but he still required that we put the restriction, security classification of restricted on these films. This is Battery Russell in the summer of '41 during a practice firing. The white hat in the lower left-hand corner is the fire chief from Fort Stevens. These were disappearing guns, would be tripped, and the big weight in the center would pull them up into this firing position. The man on the right in the ODs is the safety officer to assure that we didn't fire at the towing vessel. The man on the left is the gun pointer who receives the information from the plotting room as to where to point the gun. The force of the firing pushed the gun back down into the loading position. Here you see the gun going up into firing position. That was the gun on the far side. Now the gun on this side will fire. Pushes it back into loading position. We'll see the loading in just a moment. This is Battery Russell, a 10-inch disappearing Seacoast gun installed about 1900. Here the crew moves the projectile in on a cart, then puts in the powder, then the breech is closed, then the man puts in the primer, which is like a big firecracker that explodes the powder. Back into loading position. Again the shell, which is too heavy to handle except by a cart. Then the powder. Close the breech, put in the primer, trip the gun. This is the guns firing again. These guns were not firing at the Japanese sub in June of '42 because not only was that at night, but the guns were ordered not to fire because the submarine was out of range. That was the gun on the far side firing. In just a moment, the gun on this side will fire and go back down into loading position. First the projectile, then the powder, close the breech, put in the primer, trip the gun. These are pictures of a test firing in October 1941 at Battery Gunther at Fort Canby. The guns had not been fired for a long time, and so there was a lot of testing, recording, delays by shipping in the river. These two emplacements had 2 guns each. This is a 12-inch mortar at Battery Gunther, Lieutenant Brink elevating the gun as it would be in firing. Late in the afternoon before we got to the actual firing, so it was pretty dark, and the only light is from the flash of the gun itself firing. These guns, 12-inch mortars, very high trajectory, very accurate. Somebody commented they could put a shell right down the smokestack of a ship. Fired into the river. Too short a range to fire out into the ocean. The photographer was standing on the concrete apron, and the explosion shook the camera so badly that the pictures jumped. This is Battery Pratt at Fort Stevens, a 6-inch disappearing gun battery. This camouflage was created by chicken wire spread over the emplacement with strips of burlap woven into it, which protected it to some extent from visual from airplanes. This is the shell, about 45, 50 pounds, 6-inch shell at Battery Pratt. This is Lieutenant Lindsay, the safety officer at this gun, watching to see that we didn't shoot at the towing vessel. This is the emplacement, Battery Pratt again, down under the camouflage netting. A view from the back, outside from under the camouflage netting of Battery Pratt, looking toward the river. Battery Pratt fired into the Columbia River, not out into the ocean. Here again we see the same sequence of the projectile, then the powder, breech closed, and then the primer being put in. This is a mighty smooth working gun crew. One of the things we learned from this was that the gun was being tripped before the primer was in, which if the primer didn't go off meant getting up and taking it out of the breech on a stepladder. Here a primer's gotten stuck by exploding within the breech. The man down at the lower right is recording the azimuth at which the gun is fired for later analysis. Lieutenant Lindsay on the left is standing right behind the gun pointer. The man with the swab is extremely important. If he doesn't get all of the remnants of the powder bag extinguished, they're liable to have a explosion as the new powder is put in. There you see the gun was tripped before the primer man had it completely in and plugged in. So these films have served their purpose as training films for the improvement of the firing. This is Battery Clark at Fort Stevens, a 12-inch mortar battery, fires into the river. This was a target practice in the fall of 1941. Pretty heavy shell, so it had to come up on a cart. Then the powder, then the breech is closed, primer put in, and it's not plugged in other words, can't be fired until this man at the breech of the gun plugs it in. That way it cannot be fired until it is elevated properly. You can see the flame coming out and how important, and see how important it is that the swab man get all of the remnants of the previous powder bag. First the shell, then the powder, then the breech, then the primer. Then elevate it and plug it in after it's elevated. This battery also had a chicken wire and burlap camouflage netting over it, and you can see remnants of the burlap pieces come down as the gun is fired. They fold back a portion of it during firing. The gun recoils into a pit underneath the gun when it is elevated. The photographer was standing on the concrete apron. The crew runs off because of the concussion. But in one case, not only were the photographer's pants rolled up, but one time the pants were split up to the knee by the concussion. This pit formerly had 4 mortars in it, but 2 from each pit were taken over to Battery Gunther at Fort Canby. These now are pictures of Fort Canby as it was in 1942 and 1943. This is Fort Canby in the fall of 1942. All the buildings painted OD. They formerly were white before the war. You can still see the road leading ahead on up to the present site of the Coast Guard station. Water tank, from which pictures of a parade were taken later in this film. This was the sign outside the orderly room of Battery D of the 249th, which manned Battery Allen at Fort Canby. Battery D was from Medford, Oregon at that time. This is the orderly room and supply room of Battery D, which is right outside, was right outside Battery Gunther. In fact, the exact location of present Coast Guard family quarters. These are men of Battery D going into the mess hall right there at Battery Gunther's location, which would be just to the left of this picture. The men in blue are Coast Guard people who ate with the battery. This is sub-caliber firing at Battery Allen at Fort Canby. A platform is hung on the gun, which had been tripped into firing position. A jig is inserted into the breech, and 37 millimeter shells are fired from the 6-inch gun. Sub-caliber firing is primarily for the training of the fire control people and the spotters and plotters. Although the same crewmen are used on the gun as in the regular caliber firing, they don't get much practice in gun drill. We're firing at a target very close, about 1/10 the range of a regular shell. Here the gun crew is waiting for the signal to fire. Again, this is sub-caliber. The gun is in firing position, but the crew is operating from a platform attached to the gun itself. You can see the chicken wire and burlap camouflage netting over the top of this gun, as we have in previous sequences also. This is the gun pointer. He is getting training on this sub-caliber because he's plotting the course of the target. This is Lieutenant Kessler the executive officer, Battery Allen, who was in charge of the actual gun crews and the firing. This is one of the spotters checking the deviation of the hit from the target each time it is fired. Here we're getting the 37 millimeter shells ready, oiling them up, getting them ready to fire in this subcaliber practice. Lieutenant Colonel Dewey Powell in the light raincoat, and on his left, Major Fred Dahlquist, the CO and exec of the battalion under which Battery D performed. Here's some better pictures of the subcaliber firing. Same gun crew is on the live firing, regular firing, so they're getting practice in the breech and primer operation. This is Battery D of the 249th firing Battery Allen at Fort Canby. Primer man is asking for an additional load of primers. Here is the gun crew itself practicing loading the regular size shells. They'll go through this drill 2 or 3 times, taking the dummy shell out and then doing it again, and then finally tripping the gun. Same procedure, first the shell, then the powder. There's the swabber. Then the powder, close the breech, put in the primer, trip the gun. One more time. Put in the shell, ram it home, put in the powder, close the breech, put in the primer, trip the gun, ready to fire. The firing will then push the gun back down into loading position so they can put a new shell in. This is actual firing of Battery Allen in the fall of 1942. There the explosion pushes the gun back into loading position. Here it's been loaded and tripped, ready to fire again. Picture of the shell falling out in the ocean. The man with the swab, again, very important to assure that all of the burning remnants of the previous powder charge are extinguished. Otherwise, putting powder in there would explode that bag before the breech was closed and cause a very serious injury to the gun crew. Again, a practice firing. These were taken as training films and really proved their worth. In the next sequence, the man with the powder pushes the primer man aside rather than running around him. And we soon corrected that. The troops loved seeing themselves in these movies. Watch the powder man now. Push aside the primer man, then put the powder in. He should have gone around back of the primer man, who has to be right up against the breech during the loading. Here he did it correctly, went around back of him, ready to put the powder in after the shell is in. Pretty smooth working crew. We were very proud of them. Battery D, 249th from Medford, Oregon. This gun emplacement is the one on which the concrete building at Battery D was built. This is looking back toward Battery Allen from the end of the North Jetty. There you can see the lighthouse. Coming into view at the left is the emplacement of Battery Allen, taken with a telephoto lens from about 2 miles out at the end of the North Jetty. This is the concrete cap at the end of the North Jetty, and you can see how the storms have tossed around the end of the railroad trestle used to bring the huge, great big rocks out which built the jetty. These are some of the people from Fort Canby on a Sunday afternoon looking around. These are sea lions swimming in the Columbia River just north, or south rather, of the North Jetty. This is Major Guthrie, the executive of the battalion that commanded Fort Canby, with a new type gas mask that had just been received. We had installed some 37 and 90 millimeter guns on the North Jetty spit to guard against motor torpedo boats, which intelligence indicated might be trying to get in the river and fire into Astoria. We doubt they ever could have gotten up as far as Portland. But these are some test firings of 37 millimeter guns and placed out on the spit to fire at motor torpedo boats that might come in, enemy motor torpedo boats that might come in the Columbia River mouth. These are personnel of Battery D practice firing 50 caliber machine guns, which were mounted on the front edge of the parapet just in front of Battery Allen guns. The man with his back to us in the ODs is the first sergeant of the battery, and the man facing us is his brother, both from Medford. We seldom were able to get enough tow target time, and so to have something to fire at, the battery commander would use contraceptives purchased from the battery fund, filled with hydrogen, at which the men could then practice their firing. This is a tow target that we were able to get once in a while, towed behind an airplane at which we would fire the 50 caliber machine guns. Here the crew is looking for the holes that the 50 caliber bullets would create. .50 caliber machine guns, shells being ready to load. Lieutenant Corey on the right. Here Lieutenant Howe on the right and Lieutenant Welch on the left are filling these contraceptives with hydrogen, which we would then fire at with the 50 caliber machine guns. On Sunday afternoons, we were required to go from Fort Canby and Fort Columbia over to Fort Stevens for classes. And the Harbor Defense Commander would send his J-class boat over to get us from Fort Canby to the Ilwaco dock. We'd go over to Fort Stevens for all afternoon on Sunday, and then he'd bring us back in this boat. This is departing from the dock at Ilwaco. The Harbor Defense Commander's flag. These are some of the people who were riding over. The man in the center, Major Guthrie, the battalion exec, Captain Robinson, the Fort Canby dentist, next the Fort Canby engineer, Lieutenant Sather, the Fort Canby doctor, Desdemona Light in the background. One of the major ways of passing the time during the 35-minute trip was to read the Sunday papers. This is in the spring of 1943. Some of the soldiers who were going on leave would take advantage of the boats going over to Fort Stevens because the transportation from there was better than from Fort Canby. Here they're being admonished to behave themselves during their passes. This man, Lieutenant Duffy, in charge of the searchlights at Fort Canby. Again, Desdemona Light in the background. Shipping continued during the war, in and out, very busy harbor. Many of the men had their families there and needed wood for the stoves to heat their houses. What they would do is take this gasoline-operated saw on the spit created by the North Jetty, chop off a big piece from one of the logs that had broken loose from a lumber raft, and all their friends would help them split up the piece thus cut off and take the wood back to the houses. This activity was on the battery schedule as recreation. You can see the Cape Disappointment light in the background. These are the caves down in front of the Battery Allen emplacement at low tide. We were all curious as to what was down there, and so took a look one day. We had just been issued some new 45 caliber Thompson machine guns. And so this was practicing firing. You can see North Head Light in the background there on the spit. And all of the people, including the chaplain and the doctor, practiced firing these new weapons that had just been issued to us. This is Dr. Sather, Lieutenant Sather, the Fort Canby doctor. Behind him, the Fort Canby engineer. Lieutenant Samuels nearest us. Dr. Robinson, the dentist, in the background with adhesive patches on his raincoat. This is the chaplain trying out one of the guns, too. This is Battery D of the 249th on the rifle range at Fort Canby. Practicing firing the M1 caliber 30 rifles that each of us was issued. Practicing firing the submachine, 45 caliber submachine gun. This is a parade at Fort Canby, taken from the top of the water tower. All the units at Fort Canby were required to participate. Battery D, manning Battery Allen, was the only artillery organization, but there were many others for post-administration facilities, quartermaster, medics, transportation, ordnance, signal, made up the complement at Fort Canby in the spring of 1943. The band from the 249th came over and joined us. Here they are now. This was the searchlight detachment. Officers still wore pinks and greens, we called them, the light-colored pants, dark-colored blouses, jackets. Here's the band, ready to sound off. This was a demonstration by the chemical officer who had come over from Fort Stevens to show us a new process used against pillboxes called a thermit process, and how destructive it was to almost any kind of material. There was a pet deer at Fort Canby, very tame, and just loved cigarettes. So was always trying to get someone to give the deer a cigarette. This is the lightship coming in. There were two of them. They took turns being anchored about 8 miles out in front of the mouth of the river. This is the Washington side of the river from the mine dock at Fort Stevens. This is the front of Battery Allen at Fort Canby. This is the Russian ship, the Vorovsky, that ran aground in the spring of 1943. This picture is taken from the harbor entrance control post, which is the eyes for the Battery Mishler installation. This is the same ship taken through the depression position finder, the instrument that we had for watching ships. This is Cape Disappointment Light from the harbor entrance control post. All the captains in the harbor defense had to take their turn at that post, watching the ships coming in and reporting their entrance to the harbor entrance control post at Battery Mishler. This is the Coast Guard ship, Coast Guard cutter, practicing out in the river, again taken through the depression position finder that was there at the harbor entrance control post. This is a ship coming in the river over the top of the grounded Russian ship, to give an idea of how well you could see from that high position. These are 90-millimeter guns, practice firing from the spit. These guns had been placed on the North Jetty spit as a protection against motor torpedo boats that might want to come in the river and create a disturbance up at Astoria.